Sisters and brothers, we're going to move now to an agenda item that we informed you about earlier in the week. A brother rose on a microphone earlier to let us know that he had been at the founding convention. It was Brother John King, a staff representative, retired staff representative, that he had been at the founding convention of CUPE 40 years ago. And I let you know at that time that later in the convention we were going to be having a presentation about the 40th anniversary of CUPE. Just before we do that, I would like to ask, I know Brother John King rose earlier, and we have with us Brother Gil Levine and Brother Kealey Cummings, who will be before you shortly, but I want to ask, before I recognize them, are there any other delegates or alternates or retirees in the hall who were at the 40th, at the founding convention of CUPE in 1963? Okay. Well, with that, I will call. Would you like to come to, why don't you come to the front, Gil and Kealey?
Thank you very much. Kealey and I are a couple of CUPE old-timers who want to take about 15 minutes of your time to dialogue about the merger of the two unions which came together to form CUPE. I never dreamed that at almost 80 years of age that I'd be speaking at this convention about the merger. And I hope you'll invite me to the 50th anniversary, too. In 1963, I was the research director of NUPE, one of the founding unions.
I was a representative at the convention of my own local union, Local 1000, and I also attended as a sector vice president, general vice president from the National Union of Public Service Employees. And to the best of my knowledge, I'm the only living member of the original merger committee. I don't know whether that's a good thing or not. The merger committees that were put together representing NUPE at the time was Bob Rintoul, Brother Buss, who was the president of NUPE, and Brother Bill Black from Local 180, or now is known as the Hospital Employees of BC. Representing NUPSE on the committee was Stan Little, who was president of NUPSE at the time, Brother Clark, who was a past president of NUPSE, and myself, who is a general vice president of NUPSE.
You know, a lot has changed in Canada in 40 years. 40 years ago, Lester Pearson was the Prime Minister of Canada. 40 years ago, Canada did not even have its own flag. That came 2 years later. At the birth of CUPE, there was no Canada Pension Plan, no national Medicare, and a lot has changed in CUPE as well. I've been sitting in the visitors section part of the time at the convention, and I think there are as many visitors here than there were delegates at the Fort Garry Hotel in Winnipeg in 1963. The union has grown from 85,000 members 40 years ago I think the figure now is 540,000. That's more than a six-fold increase, and no other union has ever accomplished that in Canada. When we read some of the literature about the history of our union, it boils down to something like this. There was one union called NUPE and another union called NUPSE, and they joined together and they formed a new union called CUPE. Simple, eh?
Well, quite honestly, it was not simple. The discussions to bring about the merged union took place over a period of 6 years. And it was not a marriage made in heaven. But it wasn't made in a warm place either. Quite frankly, the teams from the two unions did not like each other a hell of a lot. There was a very abundant amount of mistrust, actually, between them. Now, a bit of labor history, I think, is important. There was two central labor bodies here in Canada prior to us getting together and prior to the CLC being established. There was the Trade and Labour Congress of Canada that represented mainly the building trades, crafts. It was the older of the congresses in position, and it went as far back as the 1890s. And NUPE was a chartered section of the TLC. The other central labor body at the time was the Canadian Congress of Labour. It was made up, it was younger, it was made up more of the industrial unions. It came out of the CIO structure south of the border. And those unions were, for instance, the steel workers, the rubber workers, the wood workers, and NUPSE was a chartered section of that Congress. In 1956, the two Congresses came together and they established the Canadian Labour Congress in a convention in Toronto. I was fortunate enough to be a delegate to that convention as well. And this meant then that under the new CLC, you had two competing unions that were very, very similar, being NUPSE and NUPE, and both claiming either whole jurisdiction or overlapping jurisdiction. And thus, the CLC in 1957 decided to bring the parties together to bring about a merger.
You know, it's interesting that there were other unions within the CLC that had overlapping jurisdiction. But you have to, when you want to examine what made it possible for the two public sector unions to merge, it's interesting. Back in 1955, the majority, almost 75% of union members in Canada belonged to unions with headquarters in the United States. Canadian members of those unions could not merge unless their parent bodies in the States merged first. In the case of the two public sector unions, they were both Canadian, and we could bring about a made-in-Canada merger solution.
Now, there is some major differences, though, between the two organizations as far as their composition was concerned. And you have a pink sheet, which I think is appropriate, sitting on your tables. It sets out a list of the major local unions. Both Gil and I realize that we don't have enough of the locals setting out here, but it gives you a flavor of the locals that were in existence at the time in NUPE and in NUPSE. And you'll note that if you were to check the membership in NUPE, that their membership, quite honestly, covered the area of municipal, school boards, hospital workers, with some members in the universities, while NUPSE their membership was made up mainly of utility workers, some municipal employees, and some hospital workers, as well as library workers as well that were in NUPE. At the time of the merger, NUPE was larger with a membership of about 50,000. And they had members in every province in the country. NUPSE was a smaller one with some 35,000 members, mainly in Ontario, but with members in Montreal and as far west as Winnipeg. And it took 6 long years of hard work to make the merger take place. Mind you, there were some basic differences in philosophy and culture of the two unions. NUPSE believed in providing a high level of staff service from the center. And by the way, as a result, developing broader coordination. This, of course, meant a higher per capita. And just prior to the conventions, NUPSE's per capita was $1.05 per member per month.
Now, many of the NUPE locals, particularly the municipal locals in the West, had a long history, some of them having received their charters way back around World War I. They had a long history of self-reliance and were used to looking after their own affairs. They felt very strongly about local union autonomy. They were far less reliant on field reps, and accordingly, NUPE paid a much smaller per capita, 45 cents per member per month.
Well, again...
Some of them might like to revert to that. Okay?
Yes. Mind you, again, after a long and bitter discussion in the Fort Garry Hotel, a compromise was developed, and the per capita was 85 cents per member per month. Now, we didn't have much difficulty with the NUPSE people. They were getting a cut in per capita, something that is akin to a miracle in the labor movement. The NUPE group, of course, had to pay more. And some of the big NUPE locals at the time, like the municipal workers in Toronto and Vancouver, were upset to the point that they actually walked off the floor of the convention once the per capita was established. And this was very disruptive, quite obviously. And it was a long time before we were able to get those two major locals back into CUPE.
You know, as I look back over the 40 years, there are many things that I'm very proud of in CUPE. Not surprising, there are a few things I'm not too happy about. One of them is the role of the staff reps and how that's evolved. I would have preferred to adhere to the NUPE model with fewer staffers playing the role of enablers, enabling the membership to handle more of their own problems, rather than the NUPSE model of staff being there to service most of the problems. There is another big difference between the unions. NUPE policy prohibited staff reps to run for office in the union. NUPSE did not have such a ban. In fact, CUPE's first president, Stan Little, was first a staffer before he became the president. In the merger, the NUPE norm prevailed, and staff reps are not free to run for office at conventions. I think that's a wrong policy, since it prohibits some of the most talented unionists from leadership positions in the union.
I don't want to go into a bitter debate here, but Gil and I have a significantly different view on this issue. I'll leave it there. Another big difference, of course, existed at merger time as well. As far as political action was concerned, NUPE generally had a hands-off policy. I think it was an overflow from the TLC and the south of the border as well, the Gompers type of approach. But keep your hands off or take care of your friends. The leadership in NUPSE, though, were deeply involved in political activities. They were committed quite firmly to the NDP, prior to that to the CCF, as was the Canadian Congress of Labour. So there was a major difference in approach to what should be done in the area of political action. This didn't get ironed out, I might say, for some conventions after the founding convention. Another contentious issue at merger talks was the location of the national headquarters. NUPSE had its headquarters in Toronto, NUPE had their headquarters in Ottawa. And of course, NUPSE felt Toronto being kind of the center of the hub of Canada.
The world.
Of the world. And everybody outside of Toronto don't think it is, but in any event, it became a major contentious issue at the merger table. But finally, in a stumbling issue of generosity, NUPSE agreed to move to Ottawa.
Okay. In addition, there were personality and leadership differences.
Yeah.
Both the top guy of NUPE, Bob Rintoul, and the top guy in NUPSE, Stan Little, were strong personalities. They each wanted to be the top guy in the merged organization. Rintoul thought that he should be the senior person since he came from the larger organization. The merger only came about after 6 years of discussion when Rintoul conceded the presidency to Stan Little. Rintoul became the secretary-treasurer. As part of the merger deal, Bill Buss, the president of NUPE, became the first director of organization. That was a new position. It was not a happy arrangement. Both of these guys, Little and Rintoul, were proud men and wanted to be in charge. There were serious difficulties and conflict. The merged union was born with many difficulties. The tension, the stress, and the pressure on Rintoul took its toll on his health, and he had to resign before he was able to complete his term of office.
In the merger agreement in 1963, it was provided that Little would be president and Rintoul would be secretary-treasurer, and there would be no elections for the first 4 years in order to allow for some consolidation, and lowering of tempers might have helped as well, of course. So the first real election took place, as far as the national officers is concerned, at the 1967 convention. And it turned out to, again, be a rather bitter process of fighting for the leadership at the convention. It was largely the NUPE supporters supporting Bill Black, who was running from NUPE, and the NUPSE supporters supporting Stan Little. In fact, the margin of victory was narrow for Stan. 10 votes separated the two of them. So you can see from that the heat hadn't quite snuck out of the stove yet.
It's interesting that the two unions merged fairly well in the field. However, there were fierce battles between the two factions at the national office. From my perspective, I felt that there was much favoritism shown by the president to the staff that came from his old union. As research director, I felt a lot of discrimination and hostility since the president came from the other union. Maybe someone in my position would have quit in disgust, but I loved my job, I loved the union, and I loved the membership, and I hung in there until retirement in 1988. You know, it took the better part of a generation until all of the original national staff retired before there was real harmony. And today there are no loyalties to the old groupings. I had dinner last night with Dick Proctor, who you were introduced to this morning. He came to work in the, what was then the Public Relations Department in the early 70s. And he was telling me when he came on staff, somebody approached him and said, "Are you NUPE or are you NUPSE?" And he said, "I thought I came to work for CUPE."
I'd like to spend just a few moments now talking about the possible future. At the present time, there are 4 major unions in the public sector in Canada. The PSAC, mainly with the federal field, NUPSE, mainly in the provincial field, and by the way, at one time was our jurisdiction until we lost it in 1973, and CUPE, mainly in the municipal, healthcare, utilities, and universities. The Service Employees International is in the healthcare field. The 4 unions, if they were to all band together, and they're all in the broad public sector, would be over 1 million members. Mind you, that might even have some impact on the CLC. But I will say that there's no possibility of mergers taking place at the present time. And there's no plans, I might say, for such discussions. It would be difficult to pull off such a merger, having given you an explanation of the heat of the last one. While the two unions formed CUPE, they were both relatively young unions without long established traditions and without, large bureaucracies. It made it easier for the mergers to take place, and the public sector unions now are bigger with established leadership, big bureaucracies set in their ways, and it would be much harder today to pull off any expansion of the public sector unions together.
Kealey, as I look back over 40 years, there were tough times. It was tough for me personally because I came from the other union and I was the butt of a lot of hostility from the president. You and I were often on opposite sides of the battles. There were many times that I was angered by decisions that you made as Secretary-Treasurer.
And some other people too.
But I have to tell the delegates that on Sunday past, you and I spent 5 hours driving from Ottawa to Quebec City.
In the car wash.
Probably the longest time we've ever spent together. And I have to state that I found it a very pleasant journey. In spite of all the problems, I'm pleased with that the merger took place, and I'm very proud of the resulting union. Finally, I have to say this, that I've been going to union conventions now, I hate to say it, for 56 years. And over that time, it's easy to become kind of cynical about union conventions. But this convention, the 40th anniversary convention, has been very different. I felt it's the best convention in the history of CUPE. I was proud of Judy and her speech on Monday. The delegates at this convention have been the most respectful. When anyone gets up to speak, they get attention of the delegates. The quality of the presentations from the floor have been tremendous, and it gives me great hope for the future of CUPE.
Well, just a few concluding remarks on my part. My dear old Irish mother told me a long time ago never to develop a hate towards anyone, because you're only hurting yourself. Mind you, you can love some people more than you love other people, but you should never hate anyone. Now, quite honestly, as well, when we look out at this great union, it's like the little acorn that fell and became the great oak tree. Well, now we are the great oak tree, in fact, the biggest and strongest and best union in Canada. And the branches reach across the whole country. We're providing protection to our memberships at all levels, and not only to our membership, but to other workers in this country and outside of this country. So our role has been really quite significant. And I look back as well at the type of thing that can happen. I've got a copy of the first collective agreement signed with Ontario Hydro. It was on one sheet of paper. One sheet of paper, and it was signed by Adam Beck, the founder of public power in Canada. I then took the time the other day to dig out the last collective agreement the Local 1000 had with Ontario Hydro before it got smashed apart by the Tories. My God, there was 587 pages in that document.
Hail to the paper workers union.
Absolutely. And all recycled, of course. And quite honestly, there were many pages beyond that. So there has been significant improvements all the way across the board. And I must say, like Gil is, I'm awfully proud to have been part of this union. And I continue to be part of it, and I continue to work with retirees now. And I look forward to another 10, 20, or 40 years when Gil and I can come back and reminisce about the first 50 or 60, or for heaven, the first 80. I'm of old Irish stock, and I intend to be here. Thank you.
I just have to make an announcement. Can I make an announcement?
Well, sure, but we'll do this first.
Huh?
But do you want to announce before we applaud? We're celebrating you first.
Okay.
You're wasting time now on your resolutions.
Enjoy it, Kealey.
Anyway.
I know Judy's the one who's supposed to make all the announcements, but Clarence Dungy has asked me to have the retired staff to meet now at the back of the hall for a photograph. Okay? Thank you, Judy.
Wow. Gil and Kealey, I think, you know, the applause from the delegates really says it all. You have taught us so much today. You have made our history come alive. No longer will the founding of CUPE be reduced to the words NUPE and NUPSE came together in 1963 to form CUPE. It is alive, it's breathing. We will learn from it. Thank you so much, and thank you for everything that both of you have done to make this great union what it is today. Thank you, brothers.